Welcome to this week's episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. With me is Carlene Johnson, and we're going to be discussing her story about a recent bill that just cleared the Washington State Senate, one of the most controversial bills this session, House Bill 1296. Carlene, tell me a little bit about this bill as it currently, in its current form right now.
Is it just me, or does it feel like we've been talking about this? I think because it is, as you said, like one of the most contentious bills of the session. It's like I'm telling you, I looked back at how many stories I've written since the beginning of session on this bill, or before session on this bill, and it's been probably about one a week. So what happened? Yeah, what happened last Friday is that House Bill 1296 passed, was pushed through by Senate Democrats on a party line vote of 30-19. So no Republicans in support at all. Senate Bill 5081 is kind of the, companion legislation on the Senate side. But what has happened through the process, as these bills have, gone to different committees and had different public hearings, the way it's turned out now is that the Senate version of this is dealing more with the amendment of parental rights, and HB 1296, which passed last Friday off the Senate floor, has now kind of morphed into being all about student rights. So they've kind of diverged. And my guess is the final bill, as it passes, will be kind of a combination of the two. But it is important to kind of back up for folks that maybe haven't, spent every week of their lives paying attention to this issue for months and months. I know a lot of viewers and readers for the Center Square, and folks who watch our podcasts, TJ, are very familiar with the issue going back to the pandemic, right? That's what inspired everything. When kids were home for, I don't know, my one that's still in public schools in the state of Washington was home for a year and a half, trapped at home, online school, and parents got a glimpse of what was being taught.
Right.
Right. And that's what kind of inspired then Initiative 2081. The Let's Go Washington got well over 400,000 people to sign on to that. It went to lawmakers in Olympia. They could decide whether they wanted to punt it to the ballot, but they knew it was going to pass overwhelmingly. So at that point, they're like, let's sign this thing into law. And then at the time, they said, if there's any issues with it, we'll come back and amend it. And that's what's happened this year. They've said voters didn't really understand what they were signing, and we knew there might be problems. And now here we are fixing it.
Gotcha. I find it interesting that the title or the description of the bill on its homepage is promoting a safe and supportive public education system. And that it's interesting because parents, the opponents would argue the exact opposite. So it's interesting how it's a very general and seemingly innocuous statement or description. And so, because we all know that bill descriptions are never inaccurate. They're always accurately describing what they're actually doing. And this is kind of a side thing, but I did a little bit of research and crunched some numbers. And our state population since 2012 has grown by 1.2 million people. And yet the number of students in our K-12 education system has actually gone down slightly. It's not a decrease
with the population growth, right?
But mind you, it's decreasing while the population has increased immensely in the last 10 years. And at the same time, the state's been pumping billions of dollars in new spending on K-12 education. So I have a feeling that this is not going to advance or try to fix that problem of lower student enrollment. And on top of that, I found a very interesting post on X by the Pierce County sheriff, where he effectively told parents to pull their kids out of the education system or the public education system.
You're right. No, and that is what opponents of both of these bills have said. I've sat in umpteen of these public hearings as these bills have gone to, different committees in Olympia. And every single time you get people in there going, this is the last straw if this goes through. Because when Initiative 2081 passed, that was, as I mentioned, in response to parents saying, hey, wait a minute. I'm home. I'm listening to my kid in the other room doing online school. And I'll just tell you a really short, quick personal story. My now sophomore daughter, I think she would have been in 7th grade at the time. One of the teacher's questions, I don't even recall what the subject was, TJ, but it was the question to her, and we're Caucasian, she's Caucasian, was how has your life as a white privileged young woman been impacted? Can you explain that? So she was asked in
Why don't you just say no? Can you explain it? Just say no, I can't.
Well, I overheard this, and she's running out in the other room, turns her camera off and runs out in the other room to me and says, what the heck is this all about? And, so that's the kind of stuff that people went, wait a minute, what are we really doing? And it was so much focus on this social emotional learning. But as I've heard brought up by other people in these hearings, TJ, is it's so much focus on the social emotional and not so much learning. Because as you're well aware, you've covered stories on this. Our test scores suck.
Well, and what they've also done is they've made it impossible to track academic performance. They've tried to get rid of testing, standardized testing, claiming that it's throwing out all these different reasons. They want to change the grading system to fail or pass, so that there's no way to understand. So when they say you can't prove that academic performance is going down, well, it's like, yeah, we can't prove it because you've denied us the ability.
Metrics are gone.
Stuff. And so, why are they discussing this stuff when students are not able to do math or write properly? And they can try to rely on AI to do their writing for them and their thinking for them, but that's not going to pan out in the long term. Because one, you don't want to become dependent on AI for a job, because then that begs the question of, why do you even have a job? Why don't they just replace you with AI in that regard? And so you think also that would be actually a bigger and more important conversation is, what are some of the changes that AI is going to bring to the economy, and how do we train the next upcoming workforce to be prepared to make transitions or shift very rapidly? It's almost like with the invention of the light bulb, and you've got a bunch of kids who are aspiring to be candlestick makers. Maybe you might want to teach them something else as a backup in case, there's still candles around, but they're not used for lighting homes anymore. They're used more for aromas or an ambiance, but they're not used the way that they were consumed back then. And the same thing of the guys wanting to work as a wagon maker, and they just invented the automobile, where there's some new technology coming out. Instead, they're asking about their privilege. And I think the other thing is that's almost like a weird form of coercing them to commit a Fifth Amendment violation, where you're compelled to testify against yourself, but it's just not in a court of law. It's almost like saying you have to admit that you've done something wrong in order to advance academically in this classroom.
Well, and for my then 7th grade, she thinks she was 13 at the time, for them to be asking her to explain white privilege in her life when she's been anything but privileged in her life, trust me, was insulting. And, but I think many parents have felt that. One of the things that came up in the hearing on Friday on the floor, TJ, or the floor debate on Friday, 7 amendments offered by Republicans trying to kind of anesthetize this bill a little bit, because one of the main concerns is that the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, OSPI, will now be, as per HB 1296, charged with developing a process to investigate school districts that are deemed non-compliant. So you've got some school districts, and you've covered some of these stories too, Moses Lake and some of the other, some in the Tri-Cities that have basically said, we've got issues, because now that Trump's back in office, they're like, if we comply with federal law, that's great, but now you're threatening us, state of Washington, if we comply.
But the problem I've seen, and I think that this is something one could argue, is that our state's trying to have it both ways. They want all the entities below them that receive state funding to toe the line. But then when the federal government says the same to the states for federal dollars, they say, no, you can't deny us federal funding on any of these bases. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. with the bitter comes the sweet. If you're going to accept funding from the federal government, they get to set what metrics they want or what expectations and policies. It's no different than a federal grant if you're trying to build a sidewalk and you have to make it compliant with the Disability Act, I believe it is. Like, you have to make it compliant for people in wheelchairs or something like that, or you don't get the grant for that funding. So it's the same thing with that. And it's going to be interesting as the federal government's policies on this goes further this way and the state's going that way. And yet they're going to continually demand that they keep getting this federal funding, which is also interesting because this is at a point when the state legislature is also dealing with a $1 billion budget shortfall, which would be exacerbated if federal funding were reduced. So it just seems like the last thing that seems to be prioritized is student academic performance improvement.
And the threat in here written into the legislation, TJ, is that if OSPI finds a district is out of compliance or deemed to be out of compliance, and that could be a complaint from a teacher, a student, a parent, whatever, there's a series of like steps that get more serious, right? Once OSPI intervenes, and the consequences become more severe in each case as the districts are found to be supposedly willfully flouting the state law or in noncompliance. So it goes up to withholding 20% of a district's state funding. So the argument that was made on the floor by folks opposed to this bill is like, wait a minute. So you've got a district that says whether they willfully or inadvertently didn't comply. Now you've got OSPI threatening to withhold 20% of state funds for a school district, which is going to ultimately punish every student, every staff member, every building across that district. And some of our rural districts are really struggling because they have a harder time passing the local levies because you got more conservative folks are going, wait a minute. So I think your suggestion that this could ultimately hurt enrollment even more is probably with a lot of merit.
So I think that this is something that we'll keep an eye on, and I'm definitely, I want to say anticipating, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it. If next year, when the enrollment does go down, state lawmakers make proposals of, before you can unenroll your kid from the education system, here's all these things you have to go through that are so laborious and so tedious, and complicated. Most parents are like, I don't have the energy for this.
So yeah. It's, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure you're like me. I've got a whole bunch of friends and family that either during pandemic or in the last year or so have decided, for a multitude of reasons, but yeah, some of them being education, public education, have decided to go to other states. So as the version that passed off the floor on Friday with a number of amendments needs to still be reconciled with back on the other chamber. So it's not done yet, but this is, I can tell you from sitting in on those hearings, as I mentioned before, there are dozens of people that sign up to testify in opposition to these bills that aren't given an opportunity to speak because there's just not enough time in the hearing or not enough allotted by the chair of the committee to have their, say their piece. So it's not over. And I should add one more thing. I know we're running long, but Let's Go Washington, the ones who initially sponsored 2081, right, for the Parents' Bill of Rights, they have already filed with the Secretary of State measures, initiatives, whether it's 1296 that passes or 5081 that passes or a crossbreed of them. They are ready to roll day one, those signed into law, to get out there and gather signatures again to try and once again make this about parents having control over their kids and not the schools. So,
well, let's see if the sequel surpasses the original in that regard. So we'll obviously keep tracking that as things change. So thanks, Carlene. Listeners can keep up with this and other Washington in Focus episodes at thecentersquare.com. I'm your host, TJ Martinell, and thanks for listening.